Since the dawn of storytelling as a medium, nostalgia has been a tool used to heighten emotions. Whether you're talking about an ancient epic that harkens back to an age of glory when our kingdom was on top, or a movie going, hey, remember Ghostbusters? Nostalgia is a marketing device at the very forefront of mainstream culture that won't go away anytime soon. Much has been said about how the modern state of shows and movies is dominated by nostalgia, with all the big blockbuster movies of last year being recognizable, already existing IPs, and Oppenheimer. But I'm not going to talk about movies today. I'm talking about how nostalgia affects video games, because the cycles it seems to go through are really interesting to me. Video games are a young medium. Your grandparents are probably older than Pong. And even though nostalgia was definitely present in some cases, games of the 80s and 90s didn't really have much of a history to make people nostalgic for. Movies of the 80s? Oh, they were obsessed with 1950s iconography. What cultural zeitgeist reaching that far back could video games fall back on from their own medium? Now again, you can find some examples of video games in the 80s and 90s that probably were trying to make you feel nostalgic. I mean, look at the intro to Donkey Kong Country, released in 1994. I do kind of doubt that was made to entice adults into picking up the game, though, to remind them of their days of playing Donkey Kong in arcades. If anything, it's to make them chuckle at themselves as they see it on their kids' TV screens. Or possibly get defensive that this game made them feel old. Because this was a time where video games marketed themselves as being constantly evolving and cutting edge. They didn't have time for old stuff. I would say the part where nostalgia for video games really became commonplace in the medium was the latter half of the 2000s. This was when the Wii started their virtual console service, where classic games from older consoles were all available for just a few bucks a pop. Many classic games like Street Fighter II, Rocket Knight Adventures, or Turtles in Time got HD re-releases on Xbox 360 and PS3, and there were mainstream games like Street Fighter IV or New Super Mario Bros., which absolutely marketed themselves on being a return to a classic formula of some kind. I mean, considering the Wii came out in 2006, this was the era more adults started to play video games, and companies capitalized on it hard. Nowadays, however, I feel like whatever era of video games people are most nostalgic for begins to shift over the time. I see lots of people, most of which younger than I am, nostalgic for the scene aesthetic of the 2000s, and I mean we're literally in the year of Shadow the Hedgehog right now. It's common to see indie games with a PS1 and 64 aesthetic, and from about 2017 to 2020, it felt like PlayStation 1 games were getting remakes from left to right. Crash Bandicoot, Medieval, Spyro, Resident Evil 2, Final Fantasy VII. If we want to talk about the mid-2010s, however, one era reigned king of the nostalgia, and that is the NES/arcade early 80s era. For years, the image that dominated the public perception of an old video game was NES or 8-bit arcade games, and the amount of merchandise with pictures of Pac-Man was enormous. Nintendo themselves were even caught off guard by the massive demand for 80s retro goodness when they failed to stock enough NES Classics when that came out. Don't worry, we'll get to that. What I'm going to do today is an OMG So Retro retrospective on the most controversial era of video game nostalgia through a series made by Nintendo themselves, NES Remix. It's a little collection of challenges based on 80s Nintendo classics, with a twist. A remix, if you will, an all-new way to play such classics as NES Pinball. Everyone likes NES Pinball, right? Well, anyways, what actually is NES Remix, and what is the point of making it? Also, before we begin on the subject of nostalgia, if you don't subscribe right now, I will make you nostalgic for the time all your bones weren't broken. The year is 2013. Nintendo's main console was the Wii U. It was a pretty big flop. There were a myriad of reasons for its failure, such as the lack of third-party support, and some really embarrassing marketing that didn't really communicate the Wii U to be a different thing from the Wii.
I
It sold just 13 million copies, making it Nintendo's worst-selling non-handheld console. Nintendo was sticking with their machine though, and on December 18th, 2013, in a presentation action-packed with games of varying quality, NES Remix was announced. NES Remix was a simple, downloadable title that dropped that day, showcasing all kinds of crazy, bite-sized challenges based on NES games, that all mixes them up. The image of Donkey Kong but Link is playing it was a pretty striking image. The response to NES Remix was quiet. I mean, let's be real, it was the Wii U. There wasn't that much buzz about it, and if there was, it would be about Mario Kart 8 instead. A lot of people didn't really get the concept and what makes it different from the Nintendo games already available on Virtual Console. And some of the games available in NES Remix weren't exactly the most beloved the NES had to offer. People were plenty nostalgic for the NES at this point though, and I'm sure there was a market for something like this, but it wouldn't exactly get over the hurdle that was existing on Wii U. I want to make this retrospective on NES Remix definitive though, so tell you what, I'm going to take us back just a bit and talk about why Nintendo would want to make something like this. The onset of the NES in the West is gaming legend by now. In the early 80s, Atari was the biggest player in the home market in the United States, but through a lack of quality control and an oversaturation in the amount of consoles available, the industry crashed. Nobody was buying console games anymore. Arcade or PC games might have still been a thing, but they were still much more situational and niche compared to consoles, at least in the US. In 1983, right out of Japan's booming late Showa era economy, a rising company called Nintendo came out with a little console called the Famicom, or Family Computer. In the console's first 2 years in Japan, most of what got people's attention about the machine was their accurate ports of classic arcade titles. The Famicom's launch titles were Donkey Kong, Donkey Kong Jr., and Popeye, and if you can ignore that the games had a slightly darker color palette, or were missing a level or two, they looked identical to what you could get in the arcades. It might not sound like a big deal, but this is Donkey Kong on Atari. The fact that you can finally get the game that made Nintendo a giant in your home in an actually playable state was a big deal. Namco later ported some of their classic arcades to the console too, and soon enough you could play Pac-Man, Galaga, or Xevious on the Famicom, which was just as big a deal. The Famicom became an arcade emulating machine in Japanese homes, and in 1984, the year of that one Apple ad, Nintendo added some more arcade games as they were making them. Balloon Fight, Ice Climber, Wrecking Crew, Mario Bros, and they even made some games that feel like they could have been arcade games, like Clue Clue Land, Excite Bike, or Pinball. They were even producing some sports games at the time. You got baseball, golf, volleyball, tennis, soccer, and that attracted more of an audience. They're all solid, fun games, and if you like arcade games, the Famicom was a fine console to buy. Nintendo offered plenty of quality titles and Urban Champion, but by now most of their games were simple, and they weren't really pushing the boundaries of what the system could do. The console didn't really have its system seller yet, at least an original system seller. That of course changed in 1985 when a little game came out for Famicom, Takeshi's Challenge. No, that didn't even come out in 1985. I'm talking about Super Mario Bros., a massive 8-world epic, relatively, that could last hours to beat, and a damn fine game that shaped the industry forever. Super Mario Bros., along with some more quality experiences like Duck Hunt, were more than enough for the Famicom to get its real start, and Nintendo knew it was time to release this thing across the sea. Nintendo carefully treaded across the minefield Atari dumped all over America, careful about how it was marketed in the region. They renamed the Famicom to the Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES, with an all-new design, and avoided calling it either a toy or a video game, an entertainment system. Don't worry, they'll eventually use the word video game once they got settled in. Nintendo was careful about licensing each game, requiring all titles to have standardized boxes and a Nintendo seal of approval.
Without the seal, it's not Nintendo.
Eventually, with Super Mario Bros. And Duck Hunt as their big launch titles, the NES exploded into the scene and was a massive success in both Japan and America, eventually selling about 60 million copies worldwide. and thus Nintendo as we know it was born. The Nintendo with a firm, iron grip on the market, yet also the Nintendo that consistently makes some of the best video games around. 1986 was also a great year for the NES. Starting with Capcom's Ghosts and Goblins, it began using 128 kilobit cartridges instead of the 64 that previous games had, allowing for many more advanced games. Franchises like The Legend of Zelda, Kid Icarus, and Metroid got their starts, with classic titles, and RPGs were completely revolutionized in Japan, with Enix's Dragon Quest. The Nintendo Entertainment System and the Famicom have basically taken over half the world. I think it's pretty easy to see why Nintendo in the Wii U generation would be interested in appealing to a little bit of NES nostalgia. But honestly, 2013 was just a bit before the retro games craze really started to become a craze, and capitalizing on nostalgia wasn't really the main intent of the game. In an interview with IGN, the creator of the series, Koichi Hayashida, explained that it was really an excuse for him to play some NES games at work that he never got to as a child, not because of any so retro boom in popularity. Hayashida was directing Super Mario 3D World at the time, and I imagine he didn't really have much time to play games, so the conception of this game actually feels pretty genuine to me. Look, as someone who oftentimes will use this channel as an excuse to play a game I wouldn't have otherwise, I can relate. While nostalgia ultimately is the primary reason it was marketed, there's definitely a sense that this game is made for people new to the NES too. There's plenty of things this game does to introduce its gameplay. As a kid, I had NES Remix too, and it introduced me to a lot of these games. Back then, I thought, why buy a bunch of NES games when this game has them all? And you know what? Real sound logic you got there, kid. That's mostly what got me interested in making this, actually. The fact I owned it as a kid. There were 16 games available in the original NES remix from the early era of the NES. Balloon Fight, Baseball, Clue Clue Land, Donkey Kong Jr., Donkey Kong 3, Excite Bike, Golf, Ice Climber, Mario Bros. Pinball, Super Mario Bros. Tennis, The Legend of Zelda, Urban Champion, and Wrecking Crew. In hindsight, it's quite obvious they were planning on a sequel at this point, because all those games were from 1986 or sooner. That unfortunately does mean there are some really popular games that didn't make it in the first game, but there's still plenty of potential for remixes, and simple games. How does it play? Well, let's dust off my Wii U and find out. The original NES remix is a small title. It's not going to blow anyone away or anything, but once you play, it's a satisfying experience even if there are many, many flaws. There are a series of levels based on each NES game on display, with each level offering about 1 to 6 challenges based on game mechanics. The game often tries to teach you how to play each game this way, and of course the challenges tend to get harder, and involve more parts of classic titles as they go along. There will also eventually be what's called remix levels, where they give challenges based on any of the games with a twist, mostly a visual effect applied. There are also bonus worlds with just a few levels based on NES games that they couldn't make full levels out of. Those are where games like Baseball and Urban Champion are ripped. Thank God, because the less amount of time spent playing Urban Champion, the better. Nowadays, people might groan at the aesthetic of putting 8-bit characters in anything, but I really like the presentation of this game. Seeing sprites from all over these games is just really cute, and the way the game is organized and laid out makes it easy to understand. Getting into each game is short and punchy, and it makes it a ton of fun to go through each of them. This game's challenges are pretty satisfying in general, really. There's an incentive to complete them quickly, cause you get more stars if you do, and to get full completion, you almost have to master all these challenges. There are some games that don't really work well, though. I mean, pinball is here, and it's pinball, it's basically luck-based anyways, and can be pretty frustrating. Not every challenge is created equally, and some of the challenges can feel like filler. When you get settled into it, though, the game has a good way of pulling out the best of all these old-ass games, and I completed this game. That's gotta count for something, all stars and all. So the big title feature of this game is the remix levels. They're meh. They are fun, because they're essentially more of the challenges, but I don't really think they're the best part of the game like most people say. The majority of the remixes are just trippy visual effects over gameplay, or don't really change it in any substantial way, and it feels like a missed opportunity. Every time a remix was just, play the game, in the dark, I groaned. That imagery of Link playing Donkey Kong is really an outlier, and I mean, Link wasn't able to use his sword or anything, so I just wondered what's the point. Really, these remixes could have played with the crossover aspect more, or just done more unique things that actually change how you think about and play the game. There were some challenges where you move backwards through Donkey Kong from top to bottom. That's a great example of the type of challenge that could have been more common throughout this game. In a game called NES Remix, it feels weird that the remixes weren't the most iconic part. Another minor nitpick, way more minor than the last one in fact, is that it could be cool if the game had more substantial rewards for completing each game. You get stamps for use in your Miiverse posts, which yeah, I'll use those a lot, but that's about it, and some other collectibles would have been cool. Maybe artwork that's not just sprites. It's a $20 downloadable title though, so it's probably not that big an issue. Now that I've taken a look at NES Remix, now is the moment you've all been waiting for, the moment where I arbitrarily rank every single NES game available in this game from worst to best in a completely objective, infallible scale. Here we go. Urban Champion. I don't know, this is just painful. I believe these old types of fighting games from the 80s can be fun, but this game just kind of boils down to punching the opponent a bunch, and any additions to give it more variety feel annoying to me because it's so hard to move. It hardly has the staying power of other arcade-style early NES games. I would rather play the original Street Fighter. That said, it is funny and cute when a cop car comes and everyone tries to pretend they're not fighting. Baseball. There's tons of baseball games out there, and one of the biggest problems the sport has in the transition to video games is the running phase. How do you simulate multiple players running to bases while also having your batter hitting the ball? This game just chooses to have you control the batters, and the running is done automatically. I can see why people would enjoy that. In fact, this game did have a huge influence that's largely understated, but when I play it, it just doesn't make the game feel substantial to me. Luku Land. This game is basically the Pac-Man clone done by Nintendo, and even though it has things like trampolines to change your movement or pegs your character has to swing on to move, it's just more vague to play than Pac-Man ever was, and it doesn't have the addictive quality it had. Ice Climber. Were the climbers a good addition in Melee? Yeah, probably, but the game they come from, it's meh. Jumping is extremely stiff, which can work in Donkey Kong or Mario Bros, but here you'll need to make a lot of precise jumps, making it feel more like fighting against the controls rather than working with them. Golf. Another game based on a very mid sport. Golf gives you a surprising amount of options on how to hit the ball and what clubs to use, but it's still a slow and archaic sports game and not really my thing. Excite Bike. There's lots of great feelings in Excite Bike. Making rivals crash is hilarious. There's a neat mechanic where you have to use turbo not too much as it might cause you to heat up, and every ramp you hit becomes a scramble to balance your bike without crashing or slowing down. Tracks could have had more variety though, and I never really got a sense of speed throughout the game. Mario Bros. There's a solidly addicting gameplay loop in Mario Bros, especially if you're playing with two players, but sometimes the nature of how jumps can work can cause cheap deaths. Not a big fan of those fireballs either. They just feel like, oh shit, we didn't make this game hard enough, put a fireball here. Pinball. I don't know what to tell you, it's pinball. There's only one machine to play through, and it almost feels like the machine isn't balanced, with more interesting things on the top than on the bottom, but it's fun anyways. There's also a breakout style bonus game, giving you more variety too, so that's at least fun. Tennis. Tennis is one of the sports I feel translates best to video games. It's tricky yet satisfying to start rallies, and this game does maybe go a little longer than it has to, but that's more of a problem with tennis the sport than the video game. Donkey Kong. The classic that basically put Nintendo on the map. I would say it gets a little too easy once you've already played the game once, which puts it behind some of Nintendo's other arcade games that released soon after it, but it's still got a really nice structure to its levels, a nice pace, and it's fun to master. Wrecking Crew. I almost think of Wrecking Crew like a puzzle game or like an arcade game. There's a fun gameplay loop in trying to find the quickest route to destroy all the walls in the building, especially once the screen can loop in on itself, encouraging you to think outside the box. Donkey Kong 3. I mean, Donkey Kong 3 is basically a shoot 'em up. It's very different from its arcade predecessors. It's a very frantic and chaotic shoot 'em up, and you need to balance shooting decay and some of the bugs flying everywhere. Balloon Fight. If Clue Land is Nintendo's Pac-Man, this is their Joust. The physics-based nature of the game is unique for the time, and it's satisfying how there's lots of different ways of dealing with opponents. You can deal with them normally, knocking them into water, making them get hit by lightning, or even deal with them before they blow up their own balloons. The screen looping on itself effect is also a very iconic part of the game, and anytime I think about the game, the fun poppy sound effects all swell up in my brain and I can't help but smile. Not a big fan of the balloon trip mode, but that's avoidable. Donkey Kong Jr. Yeah, I like Donkey Kong Jr. more than Donkey Kong. It's also the third best game featured in NES Remix, in my opinion. I mean, in objective reality. Maybe it's just because I play Donkey Kong a lot and it's gotten dull to me, but DK Jr. is just more enjoyable since there's more variety in gameplay and obstacles. There's an interesting movement mechanic where you move upwards much quicker if you're holding 2 vines rather than 1, which allows you to risk getting hit for more efficiency. You also move downwards much quicker if you're just grabbing on 1 vine, giving the game a fun effect where you have to be conscious of how you grab vines and move much more than the OG Donkey Kong. Super Mario Bros. As simple as Super Mario Bros. Is compared to platformers following it, it's a classic for a reason. The levels cater perfectly to Mario's controls, and the mechanics of this game and the way it's designed is executed so well, it's employed in almost every platformer after it. This game flawlessly introduces its mechanics with a perfect pace, and it's still lots of fun to play. It's not my favorite game out of all of them though. The Legend of Zelda. I'm a sucker for NES era deceptively simple yet grand adventures, and so I really like the first Zelda. There's a nice sense of exploration, and I enjoy trying to figure out every dungeon's location through kinda cryptic clues. The dungeons themselves are fun puzzles, and even the enemies feel like puzzles, and the way to beat them aren't always very straightforward. Not a perfect game, but if you're willing to try anything and stick with it, it's a great adventure. The general reception to NES Remix wasn't unlike my assessment, and the critical perception wasn't too high. Lots of outlets criticized the lack of multiplayer, even though I kinda questioned how that could work in the game. Would it be competitive? Would they just suddenly allow multiple people to one game? I don't know. I don't even know why multiplayer is that big a deal in a $20 release anyway. So NES Remix didn't really capture much nostalgia at the time. After years of more and more quality experiences and growth for many more franchises, the NES continued to be relevant late into its lifespan. It even got a few games released in the 90s, after Nintendo's handheld the Game Boy, and the much more powerful successor, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, released in Japan. It burned bright, revolutionized video games forever, and best of all, still stayed glorious in its twilight years. In particular, many puzzle games like Dr. Mario or Wario's Woods even got ported to those systems. Even Kirby got an NES game late into its lifespan. One of the coolest moments of the late NES era, however, has to be the Nintendo World Championships. Technically, Nintendo's first time hosting a big Nintendo tournament was in 1989 with the Nintendo Challenge Championship, but that was in Canada, so it doesn't really matter. The real culturally relevant event happened in 1990 all over the US, with the finals taking place in Universal Hollywood Studios at LA. Don't ask me who put the word world in its title, cause that's just false advertising. There have been esports events before it, but it was one of the first really big esports events that really popularized them, and it's an iconic part of Nintendo history they referenced quite a lot since. The competition was based on a special cartridge, where players would have to get high scores in the games Super Mario Bros., Rad Racer, and Tennis. They would host a few other competitions in the years to follow, but that original Nintendo World Championship is probably their most iconic event. It, alongside the onset of fighting games in the early 90s, definitely had a hand in shaping esports as a medium. In April of 2014, the inevitable NES Remix 2 was announced, and shortly thereafter it released. There were a little less games than the original NES Remix, but it focused on games released during the latter half of the NES's life cycle, so there was a bit more substantial content and more challenge per game. The 12 games were Dr. Mario, Ice Hockey, Kid Icarus, Kirby's Adventure, Metroid, NES Open Tournament Golf, Punch-Out!, Super Mario Bros. 2 The Lost Levels, Super Mario Bros. 2 USA, Super Mario Bros. 3, Wario's Woods, and Zelda 2. In addition to those 12 games, there's also a mode called Super Luigi Bros, which is a mirrored version of the original Super Mario Bros. Where you play as Luigi, complete with his altered jump physics. So really there were 13 games on display here. This was during something called the Year of Luigi, where Nintendo was trying to stick Luigi to everything they had, and it was certainly interesting. That's when we got Dr. Luigi though, so it's cool, I guess. Given there are so many 8-bit Luigi sprites plopped into Super Mario 3D World, I would definitely consider this a sort of way into playing nostalgia too. The Year of Luigi is its own video topic though, and many people have already made that video. So compared to the original, how enjoyable was NES Remix 2? Even though a bit of variety has been lost without as many games, this game feels just slightly better than the original NES Remix, since it's basically more of it but with more enjoyable games. The titles are of just better quality, which makes it more fun in most of the individual games' missions. That said, it's not that big a shift in quality since the gameplay is made up of tiny little challenges, but it is slightly more enjoyable to explore Super Mario Bros. 3 than Golf, you know? Well, I mean, NES Open exists, which makes that a bad example. Point is, it's mostly more of the same NES remix, only you don't have to suffer through Ice Climber. I would say the remixes feel much more fun. There's less falling back on the usual screen effects, and the remixes feature more clever ways to change gameplay. It helps that there's more recognizable characters in the game that it can let you play as for various challenges. NES Remix 1 didn't have Link, Kirby, Samus, and like 4 different Mario characters after all, and remixes can have you play as them in different situations. There's even some clever implementations of other gameplay elements. Like, you have to beat Wispy Woods in Kirby's Adventure with boos from Mario after you. I haven't mentioned this before, but I also really liked how the remix levels changed the background visuals, giving them a bit more depth and a look I really enjoyed. At the very least, it makes it easy to tell apart the remixes from the normal games, which don't always have the biggest changes in terms of what you're actually doing. Also, back on Super Luigi Bros, including a full game was actually a good deal for a game that's the same price point as the original NES remix.
I'm buttered popcorn, that's a thing!
Also, the ending is really cute. I like it. Go play the game if you want to know it, or look it up, I don't know. The reception to the game was mostly humble, and it kinda joins the original in the ranks of a neat thing Nintendo did. Again, NES nostalgia wasn't necessarily enough right now to sell a bunch of copies of these. If you are interested in this series for whatever reason though, and absolutely have to buy NES Remix, I'd probably recommend this game over the first for your fill. Or you could get the compilation of both games they released. Just a day after NES Remix 2, a compilation with both of them on a physical Wii U disc called NES Remix Pack released. This is how I replay these games, and look how cute this disc is, that's great. Amazing. This game also introduces Championship Mode, a new game inspired by the Nintendo World Championships of old, cause it's a mode built around getting high scores in Super Mario Bros. 1, 3, and Dr. Mario. It's a fun callback to Nintendo history, even though I look at it and think, it doesn't have to just be Mario games. Part of the reason the original Nintendo World Championship was so iconic was its neat system of score multipliers and ways of getting points, and here it's get coins in Mario, haha. I don't mind it that much though, to be clear, just an observation. Decent mode, I suppose. Rad Racer and Tetris aren't owned by Nintendo, by the way, so they couldn't exactly bring those back. In November of 2014, the final new release in the NES Remix line happened. Ultimate NES Remix. This was a 3DS release, and was essentially NES Remix Pack, but with both games smushed together, and only some of the NES titles available. About half from 1 and half from 2, allowing for basically only the super recognizable games. It does unfortunately sacrifice some variety in the game selection for recognizability, since there's not really a sports game besides Excite Bike and Punch Out. Come on, those don't count. This also got a physical release, although unlike NES Remix Pack, they couldn't do something cool with the cartridge. Damn. Super Luigi Bros. Here is replaced with Speed Mario Bros., which is a sped up version of the original Super Mario Bros. Basically acts the same otherwise, and just barely isn't redundant with the Virtual Console release of it. World Championship mode returns, and in addition, your ultimate reward for clearing all the stages is Famicom Remix, where you get to play the Japanese versions of each title. Not too many differences there, but hey, I wanted more reward in previous NES Remix games. That's a neat one right there. Those 4 releases were all the NES Remix series got. They're humble titles that your average Nintendo fan probably remembers today, but like I said before, a huge crowd of people who hadn't played Nintendo since the 80s didn't exactly form to play them. Nintendo saw nostalgia as a thing that could get people talking about their games, and a strategy they could employ, but not a system seller. The Wii showed Nintendo that adults could go back and play video games though, so the option was always there for them if they wanted to go further with it. As we go on, I think we'll find the legacy of these NES Remix games to be bigger than you might think. After the NES Remix series, I've always felt like they should have made an SNES Remix, since the actually good NES game lineup was basically all taken without getting into third-party games. Just for fun, here's a list of 13 games I would include in an SNES Remix. Donkey Kong Country, F-Zero, Kirby's Dream Course, Kirby Superstar, Pilot Wings, Star Fox, Super Mario Kart, Super Mario World, Super Metroid, Super Punch-Out, Tetris Attack, The Legend of Zelda A Link to the Past, and Yoshi's Island. I think that covers a good basis of all the big first-party Nintendo titles. Tetris Attack here can represent puzzle games, and Kirby's Dream Course is for more sports titles being added here. I would have liked to add an RPG here, like Super Mario RPG or Earthbound, but those wouldn't work as well for obvious reasons. There's a case to be made that an SNES Remix wouldn't work as well, since those games aren't as simple as Nintendo's 8-bit stuff, but I do think with short challenges it doesn't matter as much, and when you get down to the core of the gameplay loop, the SNES games aren't too different from the NES games. I think Pilot Wings especially feels pretty much perfect for this type of game. Nintendo actually technically did make a sort of NES Remix successor, which includes Super Nintendo games in April of 2015 with the game Amiibo Tap, Nintendo's Greatest Bits. I think Nintendo's greatest bits are on Daisy. Am I right, fellas? Amiibo are these plastic figurines of various Nintendo characters or general video game characters made by Nintendo, which use NFC technology to scan onto a Wii U, 3DS, or Switch to produce some kind of gameplay benefit. They were originally produced for Super Smash Bros. For Wii U and 3DS, but would get their own functions in other big Nintendo releases, and Amiibo Tap was basically a free demo of virtual console games you get for scanning the Amiibos. You're put into different gameplay situations, and given a timer to play as much as you like before time's up. Sort of like how Super Smash Bros.' Masterpieces mode works, only by scanning the amiibo over and over, you get to be in more different parts of the game. It's a neat function for those collectible items you'd buy anyways, and for a free title I can't complain. The games you unlock per each amiibo are completely randomized. It would have been nice to unlock a Mario game with a Mario amiibo each time, but that would have had its own problems. The game actually still works if you've already downloaded it, and is fully playable with modern amiibos too, so you can very well scan Kazuya on your Wii U and get Clu Clu Land or something. Even if the game is effectively a virtual console advertisement, it's a neat historical curiosity, even if I'm not clamoring for Nintendo to bring it back. I personally don't really like playing small bits of a game like this if there isn't a challenge provided by the game like NES Remix. That's why I don't play demos of games very often. I just want the full release and to own it properly. Still though, when I was a kid, I liked finding out more aspects of these games in the same way NES Remix provide that to me. This game probably wouldn't have been released if it weren't for NES Remix after all. This game probably wouldn't have released if it weren't for NES Remix after all. And for the record, the only NES games released on this, but not in NES Remix, were Mach Rider, an early NES arcade-style game, and Yoshi, a late console falling block puzzle game that's less fun than Dr. Mario, but more fun than Wario's was. There was also Kirby's Dream Land 3, which I guess I didn't have on my SNES Remix list. Probably because it's incredibly mediocre. About 1 year after Ultimate NES Remix released, it would continue to be a part of Nintendo's history in a way you might not have expected, because it served as the way that Nintendo World Championships were revived. In the summer of 2015, they held an event where participants would go to select US stores and compete for the high score in the World Championship mode of Ultimate NES Remix. A handful of winners would go to LA to compete in 8 stages based on Nintendo's retro or modern games. The event was done by Nintendo. There was a ton of hype around this event. It was aired on TV at the time, and some content creators like Aaron Hansen from Game Grumps or Jovenshire from Smosh Games were part of the event. There was even some announcements at the event. Earthbound Beginnings was announced to be coming to Wii U. It's pretty much an RPG released around the tail end of the NES era that didn't get an English release but was fully translated. Its sequel Earthbound on the SNES is a massive cult classic, and a Wii U Virtual Console bestseller, so this announcement was very exciting. It's an announcement that only applies to North America, but hey, still big, and its creator Shigesato Itoi was there to announce it. The finals of the championship involved playing Super Mario Maker, a game that wasn't even officially out yet, and I guess you could say it was technically made because of nostalgia as well. Mario Maker is basically the thing I associate most with this event, and it's honestly a great cap-off to the event, both celebrating the retro past while hyping up a new experience. Guess who won this competition? No, seriously, guess what you think the name of someone who would win a competition about getting high scores would be. That's right, John Numbers. This event would be repeated with different games in 2017, right at the early years of the Nintendo Switch. John Numbers got in second place this time to someone named Thomas Gonda. This time there's a 13 and under bracket. God, it would have been cool to qualify for that as a kid, and qualifications were done with Mario Kart 7 instead of Ultimate NES Remix. The big finale game was Super Mario Odyssey, which also hadn't been released yet. Honestly, that probably doesn't work as well as Mario Maker, since you don't get as much of a retro connection, and skill in previous Mario games doesn't really carry over as much, but I imagine it would have been cool to watch anyways. As of today, no Nintendo World Championships have happened since, and Nintendo has never done anything with the name since. I'm not trying to trick you, not lying, yeah. These events stand on equal footing with the original 90s event, in my mind, as being a really cool moment in history and a unifying moment for the community. Nintendo is a pretty bad company to their fans at times, especially fans who want to organize tournaments or competitions. But when Nintendo's American branch organizes something like this, it builds goodwill, promotes competitive spirit, and gets attention on their history and classic games. I do wish they would do stuff like this more often. If Nintendo made this a yearly event, it wouldn't fix some of their mistakes, but it would be a fun thing that would genuinely make the community better, I feel. In any case, it's still a neat part of Nintendo history that was indirectly caused by the NES Remix line. All this because an overworked employee wanted to play NES games. In 2016 though, Nintendo made a thing that taught them a little something about nostalgia as a marketing tool. When done right, or more importantly when the timing is right, it isn't just a neat thing to push some people towards your games. It's a beast that can do better than you never expect. Nostalgia was proven to be bigger than Nintendo would have ever anticipated with the holiday 2016 release of the NES Classic Edition. It had been commonplace for a while for companies to make mini consoles that are compilations of their own classic titles. Most notably the Atari Flashback or Legends Flashback series, produced by AtGames. They can be fun sources of playing into nostalgia, but are mostly just cheap ways of playing old games on a shitty emulator or a cheap gift. They exploded in popularity, however, when Nintendo tried their hand at it with Nintendo quality in the NES Classic Edition. A mini version of the NES that can't play cartridges but has 30 games pre-installed on it. Nintendo or third party alike. Even Namco, Capcom, Squaresoft, Koei Tecmo all have games on it. I think the game selection is actually really cool, and there's even some exclusive games in the Famicom Classic Edition that were more popular in the Japanese market or exclusive to Japan. It was a massive success, and for a time it felt like everyone wanted it. It sold nearly 3 million copies in total. Not as much as the Wii U, but it was still way more than Nintendo anticipated, because there were some massive shortages, and it generally felt like Nintendo didn't anticipate it. There were reports of less than 10 copies being sent to stores. The console was so successful, Sega and Sony later manufactured their own mini consoles made in-house with the Sega Genesis and PlayStation Minis. The PS1 Mini had its problems, but let's be real, the Genesis was way better than Nintendo's mini consoles. It had 50 pre-installed games instead of the NES's 30. The trend also continued with the Commodore 64 Mini, even a Neo Geo one, proving this to be yet another example of Nintendo doing a trend well and causing an entire industry to catch up to it. The same way the NES originally changed the industry. Nintendo later made an SNES Classic Edition as well, and there was a ton of buzz around that as well. Both consoles were a huge success and a big holiday item. I distinctly remember walking into a Toys R Us to buy Lego or something, and seeing a sign that said, "Sorry, no NES Classic Editions available." Nostalgia was a huge seller for them, is my point. This console's release marked the height of retro nostalgia, and the NES was in the limelight again. Lots of people even bought original copies of the NES or cartridges. It was definitely a lot more accessible than NES Remix for sure, and people who played the NES as a kid were playing this as an adult. NES nostalgia was cool again, and the so retro reigned. Now look, nostalgia is a great feeling and can be a ton of fun. It's easy to make fun of people for surface level indulgences into their childhood, but basically everyone has something from their childhood they like to be nostalgic for, and it can be a powerful feeling. You're not above it, okay? It's fine to indulge at times. That said, nostalgia can be one of the most toxic things out there, and dangerous in general. When you're nostalgic for the past, you forget about the bad parts of history, and aren't taking other people's stories. A core tenet of fascism is the perceived glory of the past, after all. Although this is just about a silly Nintendo series, so that's a little much for the scope of this video, but the way Nintendo handles nostalgia now is damaging in a lot of ways, and nostalgia causes a lot of toxicity in how it's discussed. Nintendo treated the NES and SNES classics as toys more than a game console they respect. Ironically, the thing they tried to avoid in the 80s. Sure, they might have been caught off guard by its sudden success at first, but its release always remained extremely limited, and it's clear this massive success that's important to gaming history was a throwaway project for them. They had a million chances to prove to me this isn't an attempt at creating artificial scarcity, and they never took it. They re-released it like once, barely. The scalpers won on this one. Because if you try to buy this now, $200 is the minimum, when they were originally $60 at release. Nintendo repeated this business practice with more nostalgic games in the future. Super Mario 3D All-Stars is a pretty egregious example of a game that was prematurely stopped getting copies printed. It's clearly because Nintendo wanted to create artificial scarcity so people would act on their nostalgia. There's a sense that people won't care and will buy it anyways because of nostalgia, and they're not exactly wrong. It sold almost 10 million copies now. Borderline a system seller for them. Copies now were just really expensive. It's not just 3D All-Stars, because the Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon localization on Switch and a game called Super Mario Bros. 35 are both nostalgia properties, and they were delisted shortly after their conception too. They're big parts of gaming history that were created for a series' anniversary, and they're gone because Nintendo wanted people to buy it up as soon as possible. It's disrespectful to their own legacy, too. When nostalgia is part of the picture, people can act impulsively, and as long as corporations exist, they will take advantage of it. And look, I don't like making this point, because it's the internet, you can find almost anyone saying anything or defending anything, but I will say that I've seen a hell of a lot of people defending Nintendo and any decision they make because of what Nintendo gave them in their childhood. Nostalgia is very toxic once you let it shape your identity. There's also the discussion about how Nintendo wants nostalgia to be on their terms. They have a history of drip-feeding retro games, while taking legal action against ROM sites just trying to preserve titles so people can play them. I talked about Earthbound before, which was a huge, big thing for Virtual Console on the Wii U. Do you know how long they held back re-releasing that on Switch? They waited until the Wii U shop closed to re-release this super important cult classic title on Switch. They even did so with Earthbound Beginnings. Look, this is a whole other discussion, but I will say that while Nintendo is technically in their legal rights to remove ROMs from sites like Vim's Lair, it's an anti-art practice when they don't provide an effective alternative to playing old games. You can't blame someone for downloading Super Mario 64 and playing it on their computer when the alternative is like $50, okay? The NES Classic is still at $200 everywhere. Let me buy this, Nintendo. Okay, have I lost the plot a little from the NES remix in this game's title? Perhaps, but this is still an important part of its legacy, and the ways Nintendo treated their new projects are based on NES games in the past. But this is still an important part of its legacy, and the ways Nintendo treat their new projects based on NES games is still how they're treating it, and is informed by what happened in the past. Plus, this video is kind of supposed to be a full retrospective on how Nintendo handled 80s nostalgia, not just NES remix, you know? That brings us to today. Nintendo has long since discontinued the Wii U and 3DS, and we're in a completely different era from those 10-year-old games. Not too long ago though, the NES remix effectively came back, and under the name of the Nintendo World Championship. It's called Nintendo World Championship NES Edition, and I feel mixed on it. The game drops this July, and it doesn't actually entice me that much, even as someone who enjoyed NES Remix a lot. This game has effectively the same gameplay as the series being a series of challenges based on NES games. This time there seems to be much more of a focus on speedrunning. There's also a multiplayer mode, which is cool, but man, you gotta have a huge fucking TV if you want to play it with like 7 people. Oh my god. Even in the trailer that looks painful. I like the concept though, and the menus look really nice. I like his general aesthetic. The problem is that all the games available in this game were already in NES Remix. There's only 13 games available in here. That problem with lack of variety is absolutely still here, and even if this game includes more challenges, it doesn't really look like it gives me enough for a $40 digital release. I really hope there's some kind of remix mode equivalent, but look, this is releasing in July, we've heard nothing about it, I doubt it. It feels like most people who want this game just want that collection they put out for it, and that's left me with a really interesting question. Is there a market for this? NES nostalgia has lessened a lot, because most of the people who played it as a kid either got back into video games or got their fill with games of their childhood already, and already have the NES Classic Edition. You don't see NES nostalgia expressed publicly that often anymore in the same way it was in 2016. I'm genuinely curious to see if this is gonna be popular or not, and if the NES nostalgia will be as successful as Nintendo anticipates. The Switch is one of Nintendo's most successful consoles of all time, and tons of casual gamers are into it just like they were back with the Wii. This is a genuine question. I'm curious if this will catch on or not, because the situation it was released in. And Nintendo World Championship NES Edition can absolutely shape how Nintendo handles this type of nostalgia in the future. What the fuck do you mean NES Edition? All the Nintendo World Championships had NES games in them. What are you talking about? Wait, does this mean there's a chance for SNES Remix finally? There's some major irony in this video, because the entire reason this topic felt interesting to me was because I had played the NES Remix games as a child. I feel nostalgic for this nostalgia thing. Sometimes nostalgia can create things that are good on their own, but if it's not tempered with rationality and a genuine examination of the past, yeah, it can be very toxic and surface level. Remember yourself, don't make someone else remember so you don't... I'm sorry. I guess the point of this video is that NES Remix cool, Nintendo bad, Nintendo World Championship NES undecided. Yeah, it's definitely all my video can be summed up as. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you later. So, I'll be out of my city for about a month and a half over the summer, during which I won't get the time to record stuff, so consider this a sort of month-long hiatus for me. I'll definitely have the best video ever that everyone will love once I'm back for sure. Consider this a farewell for now. I don't really have very long breaks in between videos I make since I'm in fact broke and unemployed, and my videos aren't that good. Like, that's not to be like self-deprecating, they're just, like, objectively, you know? So hopefully it won't be an issue anyways. Just thought I'd let you all know. Thank you for watching.